In our study of the life divine, Sri Aurobindo is describing the means by which the spiritual being emerges out of the mental being. As a preparation for the description of the actual emergence, he first leads us to recognize nature's method in bringing forward any of the deeper possibilities which lie concealed within us. And going down to first principles, he shows us how nature prepares human evolution for the spiritual awakening through four lines of development. The first being the religious turn, which prepares the inner consciousness to enter in relation with the divine being, the divine as the Lord, and to allow for a personal relationship to develop. Second, it prepares through the awakening of occultism, by which we are compelled to become conscious of our own deeper ranges, subtler bodies, deeper layers, and hidden powers. Third, it prepares the human mind through spiritual philosophy so that the mind may also engage in a direct relationship with the divine through its power of understanding. And it can also act as a focal point for organizing all of this development, as well as putting in right context the various preliminary and mixed experiences which are first met in our spiritual journey. And the fourth line is, of course, the direct spiritual experience. And between these four lines, we have seen a complex play. And then in the last paragraph that we read, he describes how, in the very nature of things, all evolution must proceed at first by a slow unfolding. Each new principle evolves out of inconscience and ignorance, and it has to pull itself out of a state of involution in obscurity. And so there is a first phase in which there is a vague urge and tendency pushing forward, half suppressed hints, crude and rudimentary appearances. Afterwards, these take on more recognizable forms, formations, and becoming more vivid until there is a decisive emergence which leads to a reversal of consciousness, at the end of which this new power has come into its own and can be recognized as a separate power. But still, the work is not done. There is a third phase in which this power has to confirm itself, protect from relapse and the downward pull, failure, and so on. And having protected itself from the fall, it has to widen out to develop all its totality of possibilities, the utmost height, subtlety, riches, wideness, until it becomes, as a new power, dominant, all impressive, all embracing, and comprehensive. And all this we saw last time is everywhere the process of nature. And it's only by recognizing this that we can understand the intention of nature's working and not get lost in the maze of her procedure. Having set this broad, profound background of the study, he now takes up the four main lines through which nature has prepared our awakening to the spiritual possibilities. Having explored these four, with this understanding of the three steps of emergence, he will then show you how the spiritual being has been prepared for by our past evolution. And this spiritual emergence is perhaps now at the second stage, or in some people, the third stage, and what it has to do to complete the full emergence of the three stages. But the first step is to recognize what nature has already done through these four lines of development. And first, he takes up religion. It is this process, what he has described, the four stages. It is this process that has taken place in the evolution of religion, in the human mind and consciousness. So, again, the moment you find the two words, human mind and consciousness, we have to pause and ask, what's the difference? So, in the emergence of religion, there is something which happens in the mind, which is the part where we can, of course, most directly recognize the change that religion brings. But there is the part in the general consciousness that religion has had an influence of, and that may not always be obvious. Sri Aurobindo has this very suggestive and even dramatic statement when he says, from his cross, human Christ from his cross humanized Europe, something like that. He says, humanized Europe is the word he uses, meaning that that one event, in the way it had its impact through the church, through the religion, through various other forms, had such a profound effect on the entire culture of Europe itself. And while you may discard the whole religious component of it, what it did at a deep level is undeniable and so all encompassing that we could not recognize Europe of today without that one event. Such is its power. Not necessarily in what happened in the event itself, but in the way it translated itself into the consciousness of the people. Similarly, you will find in India, Sri Aurobindo makes reference to Sri Krishna's brief years in Vrindavan, which opened the whole civilization to the awakening of bhakti and brought bhakti in its most intense form, as in the form that you see, of course, in its most religious packaging and appearance, as a means of entering in deep relation with the divine. And again, what he did with the gopis is not so much important. The way people saw that or received its impact and translated it in terms of their capacity later. You will see texts written, stories made. Some of them perhaps are not even physically true, they may be glimpses of subtle realities. But the attempt to recognize and establish that in life, that is the impact, the real impact. And again, it goes so deep in molding the character of people that you will not recognize the India of today if you do not see, if that event had not happened. And you will not understand why this event is important if you do not go deep into the character of the people. You will see, for example, in certain parts of India where the bhakti traditions have left a strong imprint, little children grow up with a turn of the heart so intense that if not for this, their life would have been almost meaningless. It fills so completely that they can experience everything in life through the perspective of their devotion to God. In Europe, you will also see in the passage of transition from the religious to the irreligious and the denial that science brings, the same imprint continuing now in the guise of science. Sri Aurobindo points out that the kind of disciplined pursuit that the religion imprinted in the character of the people was then taken up in the pursuit of science. The way the scientist pursues now the truth, which is his relationship with the divine, now through mind, through rationality, the way he pursues it with the same obsessive chasing that religion had trained earlier. was a continuation of the religious imprint. And all of this we have to recognize as part of the overall change of consciousness, as distinct from the more surface part of the shaping of the mind itself. And so, it is this process that has taken place in the evolution of religion in the human mind and consciousness. The shaping of the mind has the imprint, but also the overall consciousness has been shaped. The work done by it for humanity cannot be understood or properly appreciated if we ignore the conditions of the process and their necessity. The very nature of the process we have seen, where he says, in the very nature of things, all evolution must proceed at first by a slow unfolding and the pulling out from inconscience and ignorance. All that is a necessity of the process, and the condition of the process is an initial haphazard, mixed, vague urge, tendency, and all the mixtures which come and so on. All of these are unavoidable. And when people turn to criticize religion or abuse it, or even to dismiss it entirely because of its flaws, it is discarding what is unavoidable. What would be necessary, what would be helpful is that those phases which are unavoidable could be made as short as possible, as least harmful as possible, but you cannot avoid them. And the same thing takes place. I'm going to keep relating this not just to the historical stages of evolution, but the same thing takes place in our human awakening to the divine and even to the spiritual life. We pass through that phase which humanity passed through in its religious awakening, let's say 1,000 years ago. We pass through that phase as a developmental stage in our personality, when we live more in our emotions than in our thoughts. Or even when we come more in our thoughts, the emotional influence on our thoughts. All of these would represent that passage that religion has had. And the experiences we have at those stages would also correspond to the distortions which you see in the emergence of religions. It is evident, he says, that the first beginnings of religion must be crude and imperfect. Its development hampered by mixtures, errors, concessions to the human mind and vital part, which may often be of a very unspiritual character. So let's say we are in a transition where religion is first emerging, and the early humanity perceives some kind of a presence in nature or transcending nature. It looks at a great power of the storm and feels that the storm is not just a physical process, there is actually a being, a presence that you can enter in relation with. Or it approaches a certain space of the forest and it suddenly feels this is sacred, someone is here. It feels the presences of beings or a being, and even experiences a response or a communication from the being that says, "Don't come in. I don't like being disturbed." And when they do disturb, they experience a kind of a accident or some negative response, which makes for the many forms of wrong, perfect, and crude. What do you do then? Well, being, we want to appease it. How do you appease it? The same way that you would appease your neighbor, give him gifts. Maybe that being says, "Don't disturb me," but go and give gifts. And that may be one of the forms in which the mind or the emotions can first translate that experience. And if there is a perception of something still greater, a larger universal presence, then again you want to give to it gifts, or you want to strike a bargain. I will give you more gifts if you give me what I want. And all of these are what Sri Aurobindo describes as concessions to the human mind and vital part. The vital part in us and the mind, which is largely influenced by the vital, will have the necessity for transactional relationships. Having done something long enough, let's say you help somebody, at first you may help spontaneously out of sheer goodwill. After a while, when the help becomes a little bit of an intrusion in your personal space, time, or priorities, you say, well, what am I getting out of it? And if you feel you're not getting enough, then you begin to withhold the help or try to reduce it. Or if, on the other hand, the person gives back for the help that you have given, you're encouraged and enthused to engage more. And this is a transactional character of the vital nature, which you cannot avoid. It will necessarily creep into all religion. So he has described hampered development by first mixture, errors, and then concessions to the human mind and vital part. And mixtures, of course, will be where you do not recognize the true character of the presence. You mix it with a tree or a location, or you will say God lives there on top of that mountain. That's the location where either God lives or the gods live. And you identify a physical location with what would be otherwise a universal power. And of course, these are mixtures because you had an experience there. So it must be that there the presence is. And every now and then you have an experience far away from that mountain peak. And you will say, well, God has come down from the mountain to meet me here. And all of these would be forms of mixture and error. But the concession to human mind and vital, which may often be of a very unspiritual character, the transactional mentality is not at all of a spiritual character. But if we understand how we tend to project our human relationships onto the divine, we can recognize all these tendencies in the early stages of religions. Ignorant and injurious and even disastrous elements may creep in and lead to error and evil. So, ignorance, you cannot fault somebody. You have seen that, and this was a problem in which you see in many of the old cultures. You will see it even in Europe before the age of enlightenment, that when they had the sense that a plague had a spirit or a being behind it, the way to prevent the plague was to give it what it wanted, human lives. So there were groups that would actually sacrifice human beings to whatever they felt to be the source of the plague. And if at any point the sacrifice was stopped, they would say, well, watch out, now the plague will come. Of course, the plague had a tendency to come. Of course, there is an energy behind it. And of course, it did come eventually, if not immediately. And it was a justification for explaining that you had stopped the sacrifices, and so the plague is back, and you better restart the sacrifice. And of course, the plague also has a cycle of ending. Meanwhile, you have started your sacrifices. Here's evidence. We started the sacrifices, and the plagues ended. You cannot avoid this ignorance, but then it becomes injurious and even disastrous elements. It takes on a disastrous form when now what was perceived as a truth is actually represented by its very opposite. It becomes falsehood and leads to error and evil. This is one side. Building upon it, with the mind entering, the dogmatism of the human mind, its self-assertive narrowness, its intolerant and challenging egoism, its attachment to its limited truths, and still greater attachment to its errors, or the violence, fanaticism, militant and oppressive self-affirmation of the vital. Its treacherous action on the mind in order to get a sanction for its own desires and propensities may very easily invade the religious field and balk religion in its higher spiritual aim and character. So he's given a long list now of the tendencies which come with mind, and in the mind, the vital mixture, giving to it a particular coloring. What we see common in all this is the tendency of the mind first. And you will find the same tendency equally in sciences, in the arts, in any field of learning, wherever mind has tried to enter. And if it has entered the field of religion, well, it's the same tendency. You cannot fault a religion for it, you fault the nature of the mind. And that's why he's describing the character of the mind, dogmatism. Once you have experienced something, you have to say that, well, that's how it is. And then eventually, that's the only way it is. Because you've tested it out a few times, and so it must be the only way. Now, this dogmatism you will find so common in science, which, having discarded religion, still continues with the same tendency it had in the religious age. And it will say, if we have found that this is the chain by which a certain outcome happens, well, this is the only way it can happen. Now, to apply this in medicine, you will find this is the only cure possible. And you have a dogmatism. And when somebody bypasses that method and shows a different method, they will say, it is impossible, you are religious, fanatic, extremist, label them or simply ignore them and turn away. In what way is this behavior different from the religion? In its dogmatic phase, when somebody said, no, but God can be somehow different, and they would turn away or persecute. And the same thing happens even today. But this is a mental problem and not the religion problem. Dogmatism of the human mind. I give one example because it is challenging to our belief. We have been all programmed to think that all the elements on earth were first created in stars. So in the sun, it was like a pressure cooker. It squeezed hydrogen to create helium, squeezed hydrogen to create each one after the other, all the elements, and then exploded and released all those elements, which have become the Earth and other planets. So if on Earth there is iron, well, it must have formed in the stars one day, and the quantum of iron is fixed. Equally, the quantum of all other elements is fixed. If you think about it, the logic does not fit the facts. If all of these elements were so made, then their clustering on Earth should have been much more distinct. What you find is specialized types of minerals in one patch, and then another patch a different specialized mineral. And it seems as if certain minerals are only found in one place. If everything had been churned inside the sun and exploded in chaos and brought together in chaos, they should have assembled in neat strata. But here you don't find that. In fact, what you do find is many of these metals inside the earth form like veins. They speak of gold vein. So if you find a piece of gold embedded in soil, you can go further and it's as if a line. And like the veins inside your body, it splits into two or three, like branches of a tree, like veins inside your body. And as you go to the point where the gold begins to thin out, you find a particular mineral, which is almost as if suggesting that it's a precursor to becoming gold. So if you go back 100 years, they actually recognize that mineral as part of the evolution of gold, that through that mineralization, gold is formed. And they believed it. And then the more hard version of science came, no, gold is fixed, and all of this is false science or superstition of science. And they have discarded a lot of these things. And if you find evidence, for example, that in a chicken, the body produces the eggshells, and the calcium in the eggshell in quantity is more than the chicken eats through its food. The only conclusion you could draw is that the biological system is somehow able to synthesize an element. And science says, this is impossible. And it will not look at the evidence, or it will cover it up. Why? Because facing the evidence would show that life processes can actually synthesize new elements. And this is too astounding or too destabilizing for the current belief system of science. So they will not look at it, like the religious leaders who refuse to look beyond their book or their teaching or their particular cult, sub-cult within the system, refuse to look at it. The fact is, the evidence is there. In fact, very recently, barely 6 months ago, there was a news item about how certain bacteria can produce gold. So the bacteria feed on some raw material of minerals, and when the bacteria grow in number, the quantity of gold which was not there grows. And the only conclusion you have is biological systems can somehow synthesize new elements. And all this while you are taught by your physics that to create a new element of gold requires enormous amount of energy to squeeze atoms, force them together, and somehow transmute them, and which can only be done in the cyclotron in Geneva, cannot be done in your body. It's impossible, they said. Well, here's bacteria which is doing it. And if bacteria is doing it in your petri dish, why not it is doing it inside the soil? Why not the original theory that there's actually a precursor mineral which becomes gold eventually and forms like veins? And the veins suggest something even more interesting, that the mineral is pushing its way somehow, like a energy flowing in your body, as in veins, pushing its way inside the soil, an energy pushing, forming the precursor minerals, which over time becomes the gold vein. And if this is true of gold, why not of other minerals? And suddenly your entire current science is turned upside down. And with it, the suggestion that perhaps there are other ways also to produce gold or other minerals or synthesize them in laboratories without high temperature, without high heat, etc. And maybe your own body also has capacity to produce these things. But if you say this, you will be ostracized, you will not be allowed to publish your results. And this is the dogmatism of the human mind, its self assertive narrowness. What little it has caught because it is narrow has to assert itself harder. You will notice this in human minds. The ones most narrow are the most violent in affirming what they know to be right. Whereas the more wide the mind becomes, the more it says, yeah, you know what, I could be wrong. Whatever I know is making me aware that there's so much more to know. And this is the interesting thing with the nature of knowledge. The more you know, the wider your mind becomes, the more you realize there is so much more to know. Whereas the more narrow you are, the more you tend to be fixed in it. Recognizing this as one of those evolutionary stages in the very nature of things, because you're coming out of darkness, of ignorance, and so you are narrow to begin with, and narrowness needs to affirm itself. There is no field of knowledge or growth which does not face this problem. And this is what Sri Aurobindo will tell us at the end of the paragraph. All man's action, his ideals, his thoughts, his art, his science, all of these have had these issues, these mixtures and problems. So we look at ourselves, and this is the point of the study, not only to understand the past, but to understand the present. Every time you find yourself asserting in exaggeration, saying, this is it and not any other, know that you're wrong. And instead, step back from that instinctive tendency and say, what other means could there be that I am not aware of or that I cannot imagine? And just because I don't know doesn't mean there aren't. And if someone says something else was possible, I will say, yes, let me see. In what way? Let me understand and broaden my awareness. So the self-assertive narrowness, and then it's intolerant and challenging egoism. How dare you try to prove me wrong? And at that point, it's not about knowledge, it's about me. I am your boss. You have no right to speak to me like this. I've even heard people say things like, I am a former student of the ashram school. You cannot talk to me like that. Ah, yes, having been a student of the ashram school makes you somehow an elite, and as if the world and humanity must somehow bow down to you. And I don't know where this comes from, but it's part of the culturing in the upbringing, a kind of an elitism, which my teacher, MP Pandit, was very disturbed about. And he said it is something to do in the very air of the upbringing of the ashram. And I'm putting it in this context because you can see how easily a spiritual awakening like this could catch itself or trip on any of these distortions common to the religious emergence. Because after all, religion is nothing but a first attempt to open to the spirituality through that gateway of the four. And so here also, there'll be tendencies of this religious type to come up. And the dogmatism, self assertive narrowness, intolerant and challenging egoism are all there. And one of the forms it takes is we are somehow more special because the ideal set before us is higher than what has so far been taught, spoken about, and worked upon, at least broadly. And that itself, the fact that you are now reading about this higher ideal or choose to align to it, makes you somehow more special. And so people often say, you from Sri Aurobindo ashram or disciple of Sri Aurobindo, how can you behave like this? And Sri Aurobindo's point was, of course, that you don't judge, or they will actually use it to blame Sri Aurobindo and the mother. Oh, that must be such a bad place because people from there behave like this. So we had a problem when people went from the ashram to Orissa, and some of them ate meat. And in Orissa, spirituality had a very strong sense of non-violence and puritanism, of vegetarianism. So they had a bit of a shock when this man said, I want to eat chicken. And the people looked at each other. They didn't know what to make of it. What kind of people are coming from the ashram? And of course, the tendency is then to judge Sri Aurobindo and the teaching from it. And Sri Aurobindo says, no, it should be the reverse. The disciples should be judged by the standard of the Guru that the Guru has set. And so if you don't come up to that standard, then it's your problem, it's not the Guru's problem. But we have also had forms in which this takes place. When somebody new comes to the ashram, and I remember one case of a person who came with a deep, intense aspiration, and he was working in some department, and every time that they had a tea break in the department, which is also one of these new fashionable things started, he would rush out and go to the ashram, go to the samadhi, concentrate there, and come back in the same time that others drank tea. And so the others got a bit upset. And they said, no, this is not the way to do the yoga. The way to do the yoga is to do your work. You should not be going to the samadhi so many times. How does it bother them? But they were feeling guilty because he did something against which their behavior seemed almost kind of a crude. So the intolerant and challenging egoism, which says only this way and not any other way. I had people tell me this all the time because I was closely associated with my teacher in the school or in other activities in the ashram. Then suddenly somebody would say, only mother and Sri Aurobindo. And why are they saying this to me? And of course, I knew they meant don't follow him. So somebody even told me in so many words, I see every evening that you're going with MP Pandit and he sits for meditation in the meditation hall and you sit behind him. Don't do that. His shadow will fall on you. I said to myself, first of all, how does it bother her? And let her do what she likes. And I said to myself, well, I'll be very happy if his shadow falls on me. But when they said only mother, they were saying, no, don't follow him. You better do something else. And the issue was not about spirituality. It was not about mother, it was about their personal petty jealousy with him and the problem they had feeling somehow insufficient because they could feel that there was a difference. And these are all very narrow, petty things you will find in every community. The problem is you can run away from all the communities saying, oh, this one has now gone into all these problems. We will start our own little pure space. And these things will creep in because they're part of the human nature and human mind. So rather than running away from it, we have to find ways to work around it. And as I said earlier, if possible, speed up the passage through this kind of a distortion. The distortion is inevitable, but to make ourselves conscious, that's our first priority. And all of us, without exception, have all these tendencies. We may look back at the past and say, oh, they had it. We may look down on some other traditions which are still lost in some kind of a oldish or distorted behavior in their religious practices. And you can look down on them and say, you are so great. Well, recognize we all have all these tendencies even now. They may be nicely covered up in the sophistication that we have. But behind the sophistication, this is still there because of the nature of our human consciousness. The dogmatism of the human mind, its self-assertive narrowness, its intolerant and challenging egoism, its attachment to its limited truths, and still greater attachment to its errors. And this is a very interesting formulation. You're attached to limited truths, and then he says, still greater attachment to its errors. Why would you attach yourself even more to errors? And this is something interesting to observe, and we can look at it in two ways. First, why are you attached to your little limited truths? Because your container is small. And so the truth you can catch is also small. And then because that satisfies your container, to have something bigger would overwhelm your container and you wouldn't know what to do. And so you have to attach yourself to the small piece. I'll give an example here and I will take also maybe go. There's a very strong way Aurobindo's teaching because of the work of two very great disciples of Sri Aurobindo, who is known as Babaji Maharaj and his right-hand lieutenant Prapatiji. They literally walked barefoot from village to village, teaching people about the mother and Sri Aurobindo and the teachings, organizing study circles to get them to start reading. And the beauty of this reading is, whatever the narrowness of your mind may be, you may reduce things. Eventually, the teaching itself will break the narrowness and help you to widen, if you keep at it. And so the study circle was the most powerful vehicle they created for the awakening of the consciousness of the people. And it took such a wide impact. They went into villages where there was no connectivity by walking. They would take buses to the nearest point and then walk 20, 30, 40 kilometers just to get to a village. And today they say there are more than 6,000 study circles all over Orissa. The result of that, the mother observed, was that the subliminal of the state of Orissa who has opened to Sri Aurobindo. I think mother said that in 1971 or 72. When Sri Aurobindo's relics were to be established there, the requirement mother gave was that the relics should be received with state honors, meaning the honor that you give to a head of state. That means the head of the state level on the other side comes with his whole troop and the band and all the military and whatever else is required to greet another head of state. That is the honor to be given to Sri Aurobindo's relics. As far as I know, the only place in the world where this has been done is in Orissa. And it could be done because all the way through, from the common man to the chief minister, the culture of devotion was so deeply embedded. And a large part of this is the result of the religions forms around Lord Jagannath and various other great devotees of Jagannath who have imprinted bhakti in oil. So the chief minister himself came with his full guard of honor to receive Sri Aurobindo's relics, which came by flight or whatever form it was, took it with the guard of honor all the way through. And to this day, every time the relics come, it is done in this way. No other place on earth, as far as I know, this has been done. Now, all of this is to set the base for something interesting. Observing the form of the practice in the ashram, of course, a replica would be created. The relics were installed in a samadhi. And mother wanted the space to be of a certain type. Of course, all that was done wherever possible. And then they said, well, people do a march past. They wear shirts and shorts. Replicate that. They sing Vande Mataram before the mothers, with the map of India, before the map of India, where the mother stood to take the salute. Replicate that. So I was there in one of these events, and all the people had lined up with their dresses. And then somebody said, do we sing Vande Mataram first? Or do we have the march past first? And I said, well, in Pondicherry, we do the march past and then we sing, facing the map. And somehow the person says, no, that's not going to work. So they had people standing where they were, looking in a different direction, singing Vande Mataram, and then they did the march past. And it felt a little odd. But it didn't matter to the people, because for the form of the devotion, this particular detail had no relevance. It was interesting to see that. I had many interesting experiences there. In my first visit particularly, I ate the food which was given in the middle of the program. They had nearly 3,000 people. They brought the food which was given to all 3,000. I took a spoonful of it and there was something familiar. I ate more and I said, my God, this had the same vibration as the ashram dining room food. There's a particular feel there which is specific to the presence that the mother infuses into it. You cannot get it anywhere else. And it had the same feel. And so I said, who cooked it? And they said, oh, there's a whole team. I said, where? Let me go and see. Going there outside, it was an open courtyard. There were trees, grass, mud. It was not a hygienic, normal sense place. They had large vessels they were cooking and a lot of people working. And I looked at all of them and I said, no, where did the vibration come from? And in front of it, in the break of two branches of the tree, a photograph of the mother had been kept. And they had done a prayer before they started the cooking. And that was it. I saw that and I said, this is it. They had all concentrated, invoked the mother's presence before starting cooking, and that was the result of it. I mean, this was an extraordinary experience for me to see those things. And then, now I come to the part where you see how the attempt to capture a truth takes this form. They organize themselves. Now, when you have thousands, 6,000 study circles, people growing through that, eventually they go into different activities. Some become doctors, some became engineers, lawyers. And we need to organize this. So they created Lawyers Association, Doctors Association, Engineers Association, Sri Aurobindo Engineers Association, and so on, which brought these specialized fields and people working in them together to express their devotion, but within the context of that field. And then to turn that into service in various forms. So people from the Engineers Association would give service when engineering requirements were there for centers. So as the organization went on, they created a youth group, obviously. And then they created a special group called Army of Light. First, the word army makes you think. Well, their goal was to go and work selflessly to help others. Wonderful objective. So I looked at the charter of the Army of Light. And the charter said, very simply, that we will practice the repetition of mother's name. It was called Nama Japa. Nama is the name, Japa is repetition. So repetition of the name. And then the byline was, which is the only way to attain the supramental transformation and do the integral yoga. That's where I had a bit of a reaction, which is the only way to attain. And look through all of Sri Aurobindo's writings, all of Mother's writings. You will never find such a statement. But it was a particular formulation of one of the devotees who had caught a certain practice which to his consciousness was the only way he could exercise or express his aspiration or devotion, and it had got now embedded into a system and was going to work through that now into thousands of minds, telling them this is the only way to do the sadhana. And you can see how dangerous it is. So I was there at a public program, and I was going through these documents, and I said, my God, this is heading for a major problem. You can see how it could easily become a religious turn and so on. And I said, I have to speak about it. And if they don't like what I say, they won't invite me. I don't need to be invited, but I'll speak. And when my turn came to speak, I got up and walked up to the podium. And as I was about to speak, I was about to open my mind, there was an extraordinary experience. It was as if from high above, a piece of crystal broke and fell into my mind. I have no other way to describe it, so it just describe as it was experienced. I felt the clink as if of the crystal falling, and it had rich facets, as if encrusted with gems. It was literally a piece of I will use the vocabulary of an intuitive piece which fell, but it had many facets, and I was just aware of it, and it was unfolding, and it gave me a vision of what is to be. And the result was what I spoke after was completely different from what I had intended. And it was as if the mother showed me what was her intention through this whole process. I'm going to go in some detail on this because it will help us to understand what we are reading now. As a practical example, what was shown was the plan or the vision of what mother had in store for Orissa. And it was shown that there was no other place on earth where this could be done in this way. You see, Orissa has also had extreme poverty going back the last 100 years. It was not so before. It was one of the wealthiest, one of the most resplendent. Culturally, it is still one of the most rich and diverse. But in poverty, it has been extreme in the last 100 years because of a series of famines. And the last big one, which was still under colonial British rule, when 4 million people died of starvation, when British troops came and took away the food that they had grown. This is 1946, 45, 46. So you can see the effect of sustained starvation on people and the poverty, the way it breaks down all systems of industry and so on. And of course, everything moves to the villages, the industries. But so the poverty was part of the picture, and the deep devotion which had been established over the last 500 years, in which people are willing to let go of all personal interest for the love and devotion. And in that context, which you do not find to this degree anywhere in the world, I saw what she was wanting to create was a kind of a gigantic Auroville space. Literally, the sense was what is being created in Auroville at the scale of a township could expand into the scale of a state, where there would be no need for money exchange because everybody would do what they had to do out of love and devotion for the greater ideal. And everything could be built up, entire centers, entire workspaces, hospital facilities around the center, and everything necessary to sustain a healthy village life could be built up around that focal structure of devotion with no need for money. And things were moving or intended to move rather in that direction. It's a different question how long it takes, whether it finally happens in this way now or later, doesn't matter. What mixtures, what byways it has to pass through, doesn't matter. And then what was seen was that the human consciousness does not know from where it is how to change to a higher state of consciousness. It doesn't know what the higher consciousness is, so how will it change? But if it does not make effort, it's not going to change at all. So what was seen was that the people had to make an effort to move within the groove that they understood. And when they moved in their groove, the mother's force would nudge from below or pull from above and lift them. But if they didn't move, the force could not lift. So the insight was that it didn't matter in what way people moved, as long as they moved to the best of their understanding and capacity, and she would intervene and lift and give the change that was required. And seeing this, I understood the context, in this context, what had been prepared in that documentation. There was a list, a charter of 10 or 12 points for the Army of Light. That was their creed. Literally, the word we will use is creed, belief. And it had that character, which was a limited truth captured, formulated, fixed, and frozen into a formula. And I said, it doesn't matter. What matters is that people start putting into practice what they can and what they like. And she will lift through that and widen the consciousness and widen the mind and free from its limitations. What is interesting to see is the organization itself did serve purposes at various times, but this peculiar form in which it was attempted to bind it never worked. Innately, the nature of the study circle and the fact that each one was studying directly from the mother and Sri Aurobindo's writings was enough to keep forcing the narrowness to widen and break any attempt to lock it down. I don't know subsequently how far things have moved in the direction of that vision, but the way the vision came and the way this was shown, the next words that I spoke were in that direction. I said, I saw this, I was about to comment on it, but here was what I was shown. And so I said, literally, it doesn't matter what you do. As long as you do something that fulfills your devotion and your best current understanding and makes you move forward, she will lift you because you're open to her. That's all that matters. The rest doesn't matter. So I'm putting it in this context to highlight the nature of this tendency to narrowness and attachment to limited truths. I read an aspect of the teaching, and for me this worked, so I catch this and say this is it. But if I keep putting this into practice, eventually it will force my consciousness to widen. I've gone in some detail because the other examples will fill in for other tendencies of the religious character, but which you have to pass through in the awakening to the spiritual. And so we need not be afraid of this. I have known of other people from the ashram going to Orissa and then saying, oh, what you have created is a religion. This is not acceptable at all. And poor people to whom they said this, they said, well, we don't know anything else. This is what we know, we're trying to practice. And even that would have been an error to say it like that. Rather, the thing would be, yes, great, but don't stop with this, keep going, because after this, there are also other things to do. Keep going. So the point I was getting at is the need for narrowness and therefore attachment to its limited truths. Once you have now affirmed the limited truths, the truth becomes an error when it has lost its utility and the requirement of the current evolution is larger. What is error? Truth which is out of place, truth which is distorted. The same thing you put back in its right place and you unwarp from its distortion and you have a truth. Ultimately, there is no such thing as an essential error or falsehood. Error is truth which is misapplied. Falsehood is truth which is deliberately warped. The difference is deliberate or not in error and falsehood. So the moment we have come to a stage where what has helped me now, let's say I have done this practice of repetition of the name, it has brought me to a degree of development, and now the challenge of my evolution opens me to a wider field, where perhaps I must learn to relate to the Divine Mother in the silence of my mind, without the mechanical repetition of a name. And at that point, the pressure of the larger truth creates as if an insecurity and a fear in the limited truth, which has now become error. I feel that and I cling harder to the error now. What was earlier a narrow truth helping me now becomes an error preventing me, but I need to cling harder to it because there is too much sense of loss of that which I have cherished so much in the transition. And so you see why he puts these two things together. Its attachment to its limited truth and its still greater attachment to its errors. Now you're clinging hard because it's as if being dragged out by force of the larger truth which is breaking your narrow truth. Often people have this transition in their spiritual practice where I used to have these experiences, I used to do this, now suddenly it stopped and it's not working anymore. And rather than saying it is stopped and it's not working, you say, well, that is stopped. What has opened instead? And catch the movement that the truth has actually taken, the turn it has taken. And because of the nature of this emergence out of ignorance to light, the movement is always zig followed by a zag. Any effort you make innately is limited and so does not go straight to the truth, goes sideways. And when it goes too far, it is pulled back to a zag. And so you go zigzag, zigzag. That's the nature of your journey. And whenever there's a turn, it feels like everything has changed. No, nothing is lost. A new movement is emerging. Recognize what it is and catch it. And later the two will integrate. So greater attachment to its errors. Or now comes a different form. The violence, fanaticism, militant and oppressive self-affirmation of the vital. And this is something which is we do not see so easily here, but we do see it in traditions which are more bound to books, where the tradition is not so much bound to the written word but to the practice. Generally in the East, you do not find this happening too much. But in the West, you find this taking a form quite radical, and especially in today's form of Islam, where Christianity has gone through a kind of an internal purge of this tendency and it's pretty much discarded it completely. Islam has yet to pass through that corrective passage. And so you find this tendency, the violence, fanaticism, militant and oppressive self-affirmation of the vital. What is it that is being affirmed is the vital that says, this is how it is, this is how it must be, and it takes an aggressive, coarse, crude form. The harder the push, because it is coarse, and needs the hard intensity to feel something. When the same movement you will see in Islam spreading in other parts, for example in Iran, where there was already a high and refined culture, you find Islam also being lifted into its more refined and higher forms. You go to the more desert passages where people were more crude and hardy to survive in the difficult regions, and you find it takes a coarse and crude form. And the same text is now interpreted according to the refinement of the group that is reading it. And where do you get the most violent, we will say, use the word indoctrinated forms of behavior, including suicidal and terrorist forms, in the most hard, rigid and painful spaces where people suffer a lot. Because life is so hard and suffering is so great, they've become hardened, but also there is nothing to lose. So they make for the best candidates to be brainwashed to become suicidal or otherwise. If they are shown no hope in this world, and they are promised all hope and comfort in the other world, and the passage given is this little window, it's easy to tilt somebody. But the tilt is not done by the mind, it is the vital self-affirmation and fanatic, violent, militant, oppressive self-affirmation. So these four words need to be understood for their nuances. First, there is the violence. When this impulse says, this is right, it is put forward with such force that it tramples everything else. The violence is an unbalanced vitality of energy. Second form it takes is fanaticism. It warps the mind. Because the vital is so persistent, the mind has to be pulled and must serve this one pointed belief: I will do this. Now, again, I want to point out all of us have this. It only takes on more sophisticated forms. I was a fanatic once when it came to certain beliefs for my health. And at a certain age, I was 12, I said, there was a context to it. We read books that said, oh, raw food is better than cooked food destroys organs. So, well, we have to be raw food. And the only way to do that and to deny yourself the attraction of taste or attraction of your desire of past association with tasty food or the smell of food was to make yourself more and more narrow to protect from that temptation. And so there was a fanatic focus, and I'm using that word quite openly. And that was the only way to put blinkers and to prevent yourself from diverting, even in thought, from this one belief. This is the best way, this is the best food, this is the healthy way. And of course, once in a while, the thought would come, why didn't Sri Aurobindo or the mother recommend raw food only? Or they said moderation. Maybe at that time, the knowledge was not there, but something always went. Something is missing here. But the fanaticism prevented from the widening that said, yes, this is true, but there's also another side to the truth. And there is perhaps a still greater truth in which none of these might matter. But it was the way the vital could prevent itself from being tempted. And so you see the same force of violence, it is not directed to somebody, it is trampling on your own other parts to push down that which to you feels opposed to my spiritual ideal or interest. Inevitably, and I've seen this everywhere in the world, there are very few exceptions, and Mother refers to this also. All those who have chosen a life of celibacy develop some form of violence upon their own vital desire nature, which tends to have this slight fanatic and militant, oppressive character, not towards another, towards your own emotions or to your own thoughts or feelings, and always leaves I will say, a form of harshness in the personality. They're kind with everybody. They can be extremely loving and caring, but to themselves, you will find a kind of a harshness, which is what they had to apply initially to prevent themselves from not being pulled into the tendency of one of the most powerful instincts in human nature. And the way to do it, because you chose a monastic life, you declared, now hereafter I will be celibate, and now you have to stick to your vows, slam it, beat it down, literally. And that leads to a certain harshness. And that harshness is, first form, violence, and then fanaticism, militant and oppressive self affirmation. If the person has not worked on culturing himself, that same oppression can turn to others, which you will see sometimes in monastic communities. But the head monastic, who is so rigid, now imposes his rigidity on everybody else. And because he punishes his body, he expects others to be punished the same way he punished himself. There is the other view, which you will find in many Buddhist traditions, that says the more you suffer, the more you have compassion for others. And so you recognize that others are suffering, and so you can be more compassionate to them, even when that is practiced, which is the case in many of the Buddhist practices. To the person, to himself and his own vital nature, there is still this thing which remains as a fine coating somewhere. And I'm saying this having met many people who were such wonderful people. Being in their celibate tradition, there was something of this harshness hidden inside, although to themselves. And Mother speaks of this. To be able to feel the love of of the divine or manifest the love for the divine, of the divine, without needing to suppress or allow the distortion that it takes in human vital desires, and particularly the sexual forms. That is a very fine balance, and it's not easy, it's difficult. So let's recognize that everybody who may choose such an approach will pass through this passage of violence, fanaticism, militant, oppressive self affirmation of the vital. Maybe to yourself, maybe to your own desires, emotions, etc. Having passed through that initial passage, can you now remove and dissolve this? If you can do that, then you have prepared the way for your vital to open to become a vehicle for the divine love. If you cannot, this layer of harshness which you used on your own vital nature is going to be always like a barrier, preventing the full and free expression of the divine love. But you can see how this tendency in yourself easily spreads to others around you and then easily becomes a tendency in the society. And then it becomes self perpetuating. There are people who then revolt against religion precisely because of these forms of violence, fanaticism, militant and oppressive self affirmation of the vital. And he's using terms which are so generic to the grade of consciousness that you can see how it applies to an individual, to a group, or to our entire civilization, or to our entire phase of human development in history, where we have passed through such things. And so when you see somebody stuck in that tendency, we recognize that it's a passage. Can you help the person move out of that passage quickly now and get free of these distortions? That would be the way forward. It's treacherous action on the mind in order to get a sanction for its own desires and propensities. Now, the same vital tendency has put out an influence on the mind to now justify what it wants. And because I want this, I will find an excuse to justify. Oh, yes, mother said that you should not be too rigid. So it's okay if I break the rule once in a while for whatever it is that my vital desires. And mother actually did that with a few people, but not with everybody, by the way. So there were some people who said to mother that, oh, we will not take non-vegetarian food. She had some cheese, and the cheese had some elements inside which were, I think, there were worms or something like that. And someone said, no, I will not eat this kind of cheese. I'm vegetarian. Mother said, yes, then I have to break your rigidity of the cheese made him eat. Now, when mother did it, you had no choice. So that was the only way she could break that rigidity. Because one of the problems we see in the spiritual life is the sanctimonious view that we have because we have followed certain practices which are higher than others. I have been vegetarian all my life. I'm so pure. I've never spoken a lie in my life. I am so truthful. I'm so generous. I'm such a good person. I'm only goodwill for everybody. Whatever the form it may be, it always comes something else because that's the nature of human consciousness. And one of the great liberations is to have your virtue torn away from you. You will remember Sri Aurobindo's aphorism where he says that when God pulled at my robe of vices, I readily gave it up. But when he tugged at my robe of virtue, I was afraid and clung to it until he pulled it away by force. And it was not until he pulled away by force that I realized how I had been deceiving myself. And this is one of those very great liberating experiences. And you really cannot say, after all you may imagine, you do not know what it's like to be free of the robe of virtue and to recognize how much you had been deceiving yourself until it's done. And it's always done by force. And I remember it was during a certain phase, I was going through a certain problem. I had created a product which was so wonderful. It was years of work. I expected to be, the product to be celebrated, and someone found something in it, used it to criticize, and the product was destroyed. And for a couple of months, I felt as if everybody was judging me negatively. I was attacked in a negative way. And it was at a time when I was going through a process of internal changes. And I had maintained the veneer of public appearance. And when this happened, it was as if the public appearance was being torn from me and I was resisting. At about a period of 3 months, at the end of it, I came to this crisis. I felt I couldn't hold on anymore. It was too painful to hold. And then I gave up. I let go. I gave up in exhaustion out of hopelessness, and I let go of my public image, which I was clinging to myself for. And the moment it was released, it was such a state of liberation. I began to laugh. It took barely a moment. I let go, and suddenly the whole thing changed, and I realized what I had been preventing myself from, or rather, what the mother was trying to take away from me. And suddenly everything was clear. And I said, I don't have to pretend before anybody. I can be myself now. And I began to laugh. It was such a happy relief and release. And afterwards, of course, many things come up, take form. But that passage I still remember as one of the most transitional passages where after that it didn't matter anymore what people thought. And it was something of that nature of the freedom in every person's life takes place. Because this is the tendency of the vital to reach out and get the mind to justify. And Sri Aurobindo uses the word treacherous action on the mind by the vital. Because it is treachery, it is betraying the mind's values, it is betraying the vital values, and it is one of the most difficult boundaries to break out of in the spiritual journey. It's only after that that you can stand before the Divine Mother and say, here I am, utterly bared and naked with all my vices, with all my good things and bad things and limitations and everything. And I know I cannot hide from you, and this is how I am. And that's when she can act on all this freely without your veils of virtue coming in the way and spoiling her action or limiting her action. So, but this treacherous action on the mind, in order to get a sanction for its own desires and propensities, is so skillful, it will justify anything and deceive anything. So, Mother said not to be too rigid, and so I can do this. Simple, isn't it? And I took this example of how Mother forced people to eat to break that formation. But it happened with me again when Mother's attendant, Kumudben, was sitting with me. We were in something, they were doing some work, and there was a little bit of alcohol. They were using some medicine which was based on homeopathy, and there was a little bit of alcohol. And she said, will you have? I said, no, thank you. Very polite and in my virtuous way. And then I made the mistake of saying, I don't take as a principle. And she was absolutely right when she pointed to that. Oh, on principle, then I have to break your principle. And she was Mother's attendant. I had a certain relationship with her. Very affectionately, she then forced me. She put a little bit of alcohol in a little thing and said, you have to drink this. I kept it before me. And I took it as if pretending to sip. And I had decided I will not take. And then when she was not looking, I poured it into a bowl of water for the plants. And after a while, she noticed it was empty. She said, oh, you drank, very good. But now I recognize the point. The moment I said on principle, it was the little ego, which was so proud of itself. On principle, I have never drunk alcohol. Wow. You see the sense of self-importance. It was subtle, it was hidden. Now when it is exposed, I can say it was not subtle. It was very crude, it was very basic, it was totally condemnable, but it was so well hidden it seemed subtle. That's all. Today I will be able to look back at it and say, oh, how I was deceiving myself. And of course, I've had alcohol slipping in. I've eaten chocolate which had alcohol. I didn't realize. I said, oh, okay, that's what it is. Oh, so what? And even if I was forced to drink, I would say, okay, so what? But I may still choose to not drink. That's a different issue. But that sense of I have never taken on principle, I don't take was a pure egoistic movement. If we look into ourselves, we will find so many such. And we so carefully cover them to say, oh, I don't have an ego. I am so nice and generous. But it's there. And if it can crop up in a person, it can extend into a collectivity, it can extend into a civilization, and so on. What is the essential character of it? The vital reaching out to justify. And what's the mind to tilt it? And the logical power is tilted, and you do not even realize that you have twisted it to justify what you want. So, all this may very easily invade the religious field and balk religion of its higher spiritual aim and character. It can literally block and prevent all these tendencies entering the religious field. And we, of course, see it all. And easiest to see is in any cult. Look at any collective where an individual is the focal point, and the individual is, of course, not necessarily of a very highly spiritually developed character. Even if he has high spiritual experiences, his nature is not transformed. All of this will be present, and sometimes in ways that inevitably lead to the breakdown of that group and its end. It's only when the group has put as its ideal something which is greater than an individual, which is an essential divine truth principle or experience, which is above all these limitations, which can fit into any box of human limitation but will always transcend. And we all recognize that transcendent form of it, that this community can sustain and go through little aberrations momentarily forming in subgroups, but always rising through beyond it. And so for us to become conscious of this is very important, not only in our collective life, but in our individual life. Whatever you may experience, whatever level you may attain, recognize that all this is always just a tiny beginning of the infinity of the ocean of spiritual experience and realization. And so the moment you say this is it, you have made a mistake, you know that you're fooling yourself. Rather, recognize this is the beginning of something much greater. And every time that you will open to something greater, you will look back at this and say, oh, that was so immature and just the beginning. And when you have reached that, you will one day realize something beyond that, against which that would be just a beginning, and so on. But you can see how a religion can easily lock itself and get lost. And the higher spiritual aim and character can be completely gone. Only yesterday I saw a news item in some part in Africa where they had, in a seminary of Islamic teaching, 500 children who had been shackled, beaten, abused in every way possible by the teachers. And the parents had actually come to give their children, hoping that they will get some deeper spiritual training and some education. And this is what was happening behind the scenes. How do you even explain that? You cannot say it is Islam. Perhaps it is easier in a religion where the forms are naturally more violent, but still, you can recognize how finally it has nothing to do with the religion itself. It has to do with the people who then utilize the forms of the religion to justify their distortion. So the next sentence, under the name of religion, much ignorance may hide, many errors, and an extensive wrong building be permitted. Many crimes, even and offenses against the spirit, be committed. And this is all part of that continuing discussion from how ignorance emerging through all this can happen. Ignorance can hide errors, extensive wrong building. Now, this is interesting because this is a new term we are meeting. You build structures, you build beliefs, you build teachings, you build philosophies, and they can be entirely wrong. And this is the problem you will see in many of the teachings which claim that after death you will be rewarded by God if you have followed the book, or you'll be punished by God if you have not followed the book. Now, straight away, one can say this is false. And it's not nice to say it in front of somebody who has a book and he believes in the book. But no book can limit God or the teaching of God. I have a friend who often faces this in his challenge with practicing Christians. They're very devoted and they represent Catholic Christianity, which is much refined. And the question to them is Bible greater or is God greater? And they get into a bit of an internal conflict. Obviously, God is greater, but they know in the very act of saying this, they are saying the Bible is limited. And so they hum and haw and avoid the question. Nobody dares say the Bible is greater than God. But the moment they accept God is greater than you, he asks next, do you think God's teaching is limited then to the Bible? And whatever he revealed then 2000 years ago, there's nothing more for him to reveal, that it exhausts all his revelation, that he cannot continue to reveal. And they, all this, of course, breaks completely their fixed framework of the Catholic teaching. And there are many ways like this. He has other forms in which he plays this question, but always placing the highest reference with any existing creed, belief, and put it in context, who is greater, Christ or God? And you cannot say God is inferior to Christ. You can say Christ is God, but still there is a limitation in the form of his expression. Okay, but he's son of God, he's not God. You can play in many ways, but eventually you come to recognize that whatever teaching came, there can be more. There can be something greater, and it does not end with that particular formulation. But the wrong building can take on such complex forms that you are locked into a belief and you live in fear from that belief. And I've known cases where people all their life, having been born Catholic, having been brought up with the fear of reward or punishment if they don't accept the church and confess and so on, and then having rejected the teaching, having become atheist, lived all their life happily in their atheism, following whatever their desires wanted. At the time when they were about to die, the person says, okay, just to be on the safe side, in case that thing was true, please call the priest, let me confess, and be given the blessing that I'll enter heaven. Just in case. And what that says is the formation which was imposed on the mind was never really dissolved. It was there as a reference always, in case. And of course, I can do that at the last step before I leave my body. Till then, I don't want that box. Now, let me re enter the box so that I get the passage to that promised thing. So, extensive wrong building. In India, you will find the same idea taking a more strange form in certain religious teachings where they will say, karma is so fixed that if you cause harm to an animal, next life you will be born as that animal and someone else will do it to you. Now, if you see the logic of it, let's say even it is possible that you're born as an animal and now someone else has to do it to you what you did to the animal, or maybe that animal has to do it to you, then what about his karma? He must now take birth as an animal. If this were the law, then everybody would end up becoming animals, suffering all the things we have done to animals. It's meaningless. But the structure of the box belief is so complex and so tightly fitted that if someone grows up into that and does not cut through it, it will stay forever, for the rest of his life. So, an extensive wrong building be permitted, many crimes, even offenses against the spirit be committed. So, crimes will include all these things we have discussed, but also even wars have been done. And offenses to the spirit, where you have tortured another human being, punished them for not following your belief. When the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna says, each time you hurt yourself, it was in this context, but any other being, you hurt me who lives in that being. And if you recognize that the divine presence is in every heart, to punish an individual is to punish the divine presence. Well, you can see how religions have created so much offense against the spirit. And there are other kinds of offenses, even of mental offense, where you reduce the spirit to your own belief system and so on. But all of this he has mapped out as the distortions that come in that first early phase of the emergence of religion. But then now he generalizes this to all other activities. But this checkered history belongs to all human effort. Checkered, where you have the chessboard, black and white. What is interesting about the checkered structure, and he uses this word very carefully, you cannot go from white to white. There is no way to do that. Because after every white, there is a black. You go forward, there's a black, and then again another white. You go sideways, there's a black, and then again another white. You cannot stay on a white long either. Stay on the white, if you take a step, eventually you stay on a black, you take a step, you'll hit a white. And the nature of checkered history is that you cannot stay always right or always wrong. You'll always tend to jump from one to the other. And that's, remember, the first phase of any emergence of a greater truth out of ignorance. So, this word checkered, he uses very precisely, belongs to all human effort. And if it were to count against the truth and necessity of religion, would count also against the truth and necessity of every other line of human endeavor, against all man's action, his ideals, his thought, his art, his science. So if you want to throw away religion because of this checkered earlier history, you have to throw away everything or condemn everything equally. But what is it that he's pointing to? That in spite of this checkered history, there is a truth and necessity of religion. And the truth is what we have already discussed, to enter in relation with the divine, not only in the highest aspect of the divine, but in the various secondary and tertiary powers of the divine, also in the manifestation, to be able to enter in relation with them. But the necessity, there's a truth, but there's a necessity. That truth cannot be realized by any other means except through the religious passage. And the character of the religious passage is entering one-on-one in relation with those presences. If possible, you would enter directly in relation to the highest. That's too big for your little bowl, for your little mind. Well, you have to catch a limited piece. And only when that relation has allowed you to widen, that you can enter in relation now with a still wider aspect of the divine truth, and so on. And across many facets and aspects of the divine truth, you will develop greater and greater completeness until your consciousness has sufficiently evolved to embrace the totality of the divine. At that point, or already when you have begun to recognize that there is such a thing, you have outgrown religion. And you're entering the full free space of spiritual development. But that's second level of development, where the thing comes into its own, can be recognized, and now prepares for the true third level of the full blossoming of the spiritual domain. But religion is going to give birth to this spiritual experience or spiritual consciousness or some kind of a knowledge or a first access which can come into its own separate from the lower mental, emotional, and vital consciousness. That much religion has to give birth to. And then only the third phase could happen. So this is going to be two words he uses: truth and necessity of religion, and equally truth and necessity of every other line of human endeavor would go through a checkered phase like this. All man's action. So line of human endeavor is a very broad term. Anything you try to do, this will happen. Let's say you're trying to build something new, a structure that has never been built before. Inevitably, you'll have your checkered passage, and all these tendencies will be there. So you look at Orwell, something which has never been created, well, you will have all these tendencies. But if you're living in a consciousness which is more awake, you will recognize those tendencies and quickly bypass. Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase in his letters when he speaks of certain tendencies of human nature and the need to pass through certain experiences. He says all these experiences have to be passed through and quickly passed through and overpassed. This is the word he uses. You go beyond. And okay, we will have the tendency, we recognize, and we make a conscious effort. So, any line of human endeavor and against all man's actions, you try to do any work, you will have a checkered passage. You will have ignorance popping in, errors coming in, and all those distortions. All his ideals, all his thought, his art, his science. And I took examples from science to show how the science has at least as many distortions as it criticizes religion for having had. Having expressed this in the first paragraph in the discussion on religion, Sri Aurobindo moves on to how religion has opened itself to many kinds of things. It has opened itself to denial by its claim of to determine the truth by divine authority, inspiration, infallible sovereignty, and so on. Premature claims, how they have come up. And all of these were as if steps towards a higher truth or distortions of a higher truth descending. So, this is what he will show us in the next paragraph. That in the very act of a higher power coming down, the attempt of the human mind to catch it is going to bring in distortions. And that's the list that he will now give. So the first distortion which we went through in this paragraph is your attempt to rise, which has all these elements of your distortion. But the other is when something higher descends, your ability to receive also brings a different kind of set of distortions, which we will see next Sunday. And after that, he will show how nature has lots of supple and wide methods to go around these things, to bypass all these limitations, even to allow for religion to grow without seriously being lost in these distortions. And how that is possible, he will show us. So while the distortions are inevitable, they need not block or limit us. We can go around them, and religion itself can grow to something which approaches spirituality so closely that it ceases to be religion in its narrow sense. All of this is discussion to follow. We can meditate on this for half a minute.